This is the best-selling Android phone in the world, and it's an even bigger deal than you think. If you look at the annual smartphone sales charts, basically every single year you'll see the exact same trend. The entire top 10 is basically iPhone, 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 but then a Galaxy A series.
What?
Specifically the Galaxy A10 series, and then a little while later, the Galaxy A0 series. And while obviously one major takeaway from this list is, damn,
son.
Apple sells a lot of iPhones. In a way, it's Samsung's achievement that's the even more surprising one. Because remember, Apple only makes 4 models a year. Samsung makes about 50. They have A models, S models, M models, Z models, so for just one of those 50 models to come in 4th place, to sell 30 million units on its own is absolutely astronomical. But on the face of it, doesn't really make any sense. Samsung holds massive launch events for their flagship phones. They fill up vast spaces with reporters from every corner of the globe. But this Galaxy A14 doesn't even have a launch event. Or even a trailer in the West. You can only find quick summary videos on Samsung's India or Malaysia or Thailand pages. And yeah, sure, some of these have some pretty impressive view counts, but all you have to do is to look at the comments to realize that none of this is organic reach and no one actually cares about them. So why are these A-series phones by far Samsung's best-selling, specifically this A10 series of them? And just before we get into it, we're going to start a battery test of the Samsung A14 versus the iPhone 14. So the first, most obvious thing that makes this so popular is price. This A14 is around $150 outright, including delivery, and that's actually quite impressive considering what you get. A 6.6-inch 1080p display, the very latest Android 13, 50-megapixel main camera, huge 5,000 mAh battery, and yeah, sure, some nice thick borders around the outside of the screen, but enough fundamentals such that when I handed this phone to my fiance and asked her how much she thought it was, she said 400. And it's only when I started setting the phone up that I properly realized how they've got to this price. I kid you not, when I first booted it up, I was assaulted by recommended apps. There were 3 separate pages of supposedly free goodies that the phone wanted to install for me. It asked my gender and my age to try and target its recommendations, and even went as far as to tick yes to half of the apps by default. Samsung will obviously be charging all of these app companies to feature on these pages, probably taking extra money for the app to be selected by default, which is great for them because it takes the pressure off needing to make money off the hardware itself. And it's a pretty standard trick for cheaper phones like this, but it is kind of crazy that they're allowed to just cover up very clearly sponsored apps by literally describing them as if they're essential to the user. But there's one more, even subtler way that Samsung is able to keep this phone so cheap. When you first look at this phone, it very much looks like this is running Samsung's One UI skin, right? The same skin that its flagship Galaxy S series phones are running. But look a little closer and you see this is not the same One UI 5 that the S23 Ultra uses. This is One UI Core 5. Which is a nice way of saying we've stripped out all of the nice-to-have features that we don't think are completely necessary and left it plain. And this saves them even more money. It means that every time there's a software update, for example, the company only has like 1/3 of the features that they need to go through and manually tweak for that update. And also, because it is so simple, there's just less that can go wrong, which helps to minimize the amount of time that Samsung spends fixing these budget phones. And regardless of how irritating all of this is, it's what's allowed Samsung to hit this $150 price point. And naturally, the more affordable the phone is, the more it's going to sell. But there are loads of cheap phones out there, so it still doesn't fully explain why this one. Well, design has a surprisingly big part to play. See, when you're choosing the design of your phone, the decision is not just how do we make each device as cool looking as possible. The design is also the single most important factor determining how people perceive where that model is positioned within your lineup. And there's 2 different ways that you could go here. One route is the Apple route, where your more affordable phones are very clearly differentiated in design from your flagship phones. I mean, Apple makes absolute sure that no one who's looking at the iPhone 14 Pro Max, for example, is even going to consider getting the $400 iPhone SE. They've designed them to look like incomparable experiences, and that if you want the best, got to pay for the best. Which is also why they only use matte finishes on their Pro models. It doesn't cost them more to do, and they might actually sell more phones in total if they use these slick matte finishes on every one of their phones. But they don't want that. They want fewer people to buy their very highest end models. But Samsung does the opposite. The entire appeal of this A-series set of phones is literally, this is like the S-series on a budget. They very closely match their cheaper phones to their more expensive phones in terms of design language. They make sure they still have multiple cameras like the S-series does. They make sure that even the cheapest phones get a nice matte textured back. And this makes their entire lineup a very smooth sliding scale, where at every $30 to $50 price increment, there's a new option with slightly better features. And this kind of structure means that most people are going to tend to start looking somewhere around the mid-range for their phone, and then just scale up or scale down from there depending on what they decide they need. And more importantly for for this video, it makes their entry-level phones like the A14 feel like the best value. It's Samsung effectively spending some of the brand power and the reputation that they've earned from having some really high-end phones to shift more units of their lower-end phones. But the A14 is not actually the lowest-end phone Samsung makes. The way this A series works is you have two numbers. The first is the tier of phone we're in, and the second is the generation we're on. Oi, stay away from my Crocs. So for example, last year's phone in the same price tier as this was the Galaxy A13, and a sub to the channel would be a Mazeballs. But Samsung does also have a zero tier. But see, no one wants to have the worst phone. It's actually a very well-documented phenomenon that people, when it comes to anything, are afraid to be the extreme option. They always like to sit somewhere in the middle. There's a sense of comfort that comes from knowing that there are people both above you, who in this case have taken a bigger gamble by spending more money, and also below you, who've got the most basic feature set. It means that so long as you're in between those two extremes, you're cushioned from risk, in a sense. This is why if you ask someone to pick a number between two numbers, they'll be much more likely to pick something in the middle of those two numbers as opposed to the ends. This is why almost every website puts the option that they really want you to buy in the middle. This is why in a row of 4 bathroom stalls, people are twice as likely to use the 2 in between. Remember that if you want to clean up poop next time. Pick a letter of the alphabet, A to Z.
L.
If you had 4 bathroom stalls directly next to each other, which one would you use?
The second one.
The point being, even though it's still sitting on the lower end in the big picture, I think these A12, A13, A14 phones being just one tier above the very lowest end makes them feel like a sweet spot to most people. Okay, so the phone is great value, it looks like a more expensive phone, it's positioned in that sweet spot, but still, 30 million units every year. It dwarves every other Android phone, and to do that, it also needs a few other things. The first being availability. The vast majority of low to mid-range Android phones, they have quite limited availability. Either they'll launch in just China, or they'll just launch in India, or maybe a few hand-picked European countries. And there is a reason for that. When you branch out all across the world, you start racking up major shipping costs. You've got to work with all manner of local carriers. You've got to add in different antenna to work with local signal bands. You've got to make deals with local retailers who will then proceed to take their own cut. And so because the profit margins tend to be so slim on these phones anyway, it's often only worth selling them in the countries that they're being manufactured in. But these A-series phones, they're basically everywhere. Samsung uses the distribution channels and the brand image that they've already built up for their premium flagship phones to get these A-series prime positions in stores all across Europe, North America, Latin America, Middle East, Africa, effectively the world. But it's not just that they're present everywhere, they're also marketed in a way that goes for the broadest possible appeal in these markets. Like, take a look at the website listing for Samsung's S23 Ultra for a second. It goes section by section, intricately describing the thought process behind each and every feature, the eco-consciousness, the choice of materials, and even the specific processor being used. This listing is designed for someone who's interested in the technology and who wants to know more about everything that the phone is capable of. But the tone is completely different here. And yeah, some part of it is just the fact that there's naturally less to talk about with a cheap phone. But look at their supposed selling points. Like, one of them just says 6.6-inch display. Not refresh rate, not which technology, not resolution, which, given that this is a 1080p panel, I'd actually say would be something to boast about for this price. Just the size of it. 50 megapixel camera, which as we know means basically nothing when it comes to the end image output. And let's be very clear, 50 megapixel here is very different to the 50 megapixel camera you can see on higher end phones. Still decent results thanks to good software processing, but at this level, the phone actually being capable of 50 megapixels is meaningless. But they go further because their next point is just the fact that this has an octa-core processor, as if phones literally 10 years ago didn't already have octa-core chips. The entire listing here is designed for someone who either doesn't really care about their phone as much, or someone who isn't as clued up, which pains me to say is the vast majority of people on this planet. So just the fact that you're watching this means we are in the minority. Now remember, this is not necessarily because people don't want to know though. It's just that large parts of the world are still quite tech illiterate. They either haven't had access to the internet for very long, a means to learn about tech, or a need to learn about tech. And so this kind of simple, broad marketing also appeals to that kind of user. This is why the only trailers for the A10 series we saw were focused on developing or newly industrialized countries that have only recently started increasing in income and tech proliferation. Samsung does also sell the A14 here in the UK too, but notice how they haven't released the A14 trailer here, because they know in the UK people on average have higher income and higher tech literacy, and so they would much rather that we buy the flagship S series. But there's another thing you have to do if you want to become the most broadly appealing. You have to exclude as few people as possible. You've got to make a phone that can fit into as many different kinds of lifestyles as possible. And this does that. It's got a micro SD card slot, so anyone who wants more storage can add it for cheap. It's got a headphone jack, so assuming you don't want to spend hundreds of dollars on expensive wireless earphones, you can still listen to music using the earphones you already have. This thing has insane battery life, like genuinely longer than almost any flagship phone, which means that for people doing non-office, more manual jobs with less access to power throughout the day, you have the assurance that it's not going to run out. And I guess to prove that point, I've been running a continuous benchmark on both of these phones for the last couple of hours, and while you can obviously see that the maximum amount of power of the iPhone 14 is leagues ahead of this phone, the battery difference is just as vast. Like for example, this iPhone here is on 57%, the Samsung's on 80%. But there's one more, even subtler way that Samsung is able to keep this phone so cheap. Notice, this is the opposite of what companies do with their top-end phones. Companies know full well that if you're going to buy a flagship, that you've got even more spare money. So, let's remove the headphone jack and sell you on earphones. Let's remove expandable storage and sell you a storage upgrade for $200. Oh, let's add in wireless charging so you can buy our wireless charger. Flagships purposefully eliminate the majority of the market to make more from the 10% of people who have a lot. For example, if you decide to buy a case, for the A14 you have far fewer options than the S23 Ultra, because Samsung know people who spend $150 on their phone aren't going to be spending a lot on accessorizing it. But then, more shockingly, the options they do have are actually cheaper than the same cases for the more expensive phones. Why would that be? Does this case cost any less to make than this case? Not really. Or like on Samsung's own site, for this phone, you can buy a screen protector, but for the flagship, you can only buy them in packs of 2. It's them knowing that you bought a flagship, and therefore knowing what that means about your willingness to spend. And so, yeah, here at $150, ironically, you actually need to spend less on extras to make this work. But there is also one catch with these cheaper phones in general, an invisible caveat that does result in more of these units being sold. Budget phones aren't designed with longevity in mind. So you know how for flagships, the average person is upgrading about once every 3 years? Well, I was talking to a couple of people from Xiaomi's India team not too long ago, and they were saying that only recently the smartphone upgrade cycle at this price point managed to reach once every 6 months. They said that the real tech enthusiasts in any family would buy the latest Xiaomi phone, and then when the next Xiaomi release happened, they would buy that one and just hand down the existing phone that they'd been using to another family member. This is why companies catering to these price points, they often release both a phone and then the upgrade to that phone within the same year. This would never happen in the US market. And what this turnaround also means is you get less software support. And it's not just that you get the less feature-rich, less optimized One UI core software, but also Samsung's kind of built quite a strong reputation for their guarantee of 4 years of upgrades on their phones, right? Yeah, well, that doesn't actually apply to this. You only get 2 here. And this is the icing on the cake to keeping those sales figures high. And because there's less price friction in the lower end of the market, because you've invested less on your existing phone and you'd be spending less to upgrade to the next one, it feels like less of a loss to keep on upgrading. And this is footage from the most popular Android smartphone in the world. Now, one stat that's really surprised me recently, even more so than the ridiculous number of units this thing sells, is how much data breaches are going up every year. You essentially get data brokers who make their entire living out of collating often stolen data from everyone who's logged into these websites. Names, social security numbers, locations, everything. This data is then sold to businesses and can often fall into the hands of criminals. Fun fact, a single jumbo data leak recently managed to divulge 1.2 billion of people's records. The good news is you have a right to privacy. The bad news is it would take you years to delete all your data manually. And this is why Incogni exists. It reaches out to data brokers on your behalf, requests your personal data removal using your human rights as the grounds, and even deals with objections from their end should they arise. And it does this continually, because even when your data gets removed, it can still appear in follow-up leaks and needs to be kept on top of. So I've literally had my data in the hands of 67 of these data brokers. You can see who has your data, how sensitive the data is, and you can see in real time Incogni whittling through this list and resolving each problem one at a time. Oh, and we have a pretty cool code. If you use Mr. Who's the Boss at checkout, you don't get like a 10 or a 20% discount, you get a 60% discount. And you also get a 30-day money-back guarantee.